Thank you, Marianne. I'm very happy to be here. I'm an academic, I'm a professor, but my research is very much focused on trying to make change in the real world. And the work that's being done here today is really where the rubber hits the road, right? The type of research we do doesn't really mean anything, at least in my mind, if it isn't getting out there in the community and if it isn't being used to make change. So a deep thanks to Marianne and all the others who have put their time into organizing this session today. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm here to talk about a report that we published through the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. This was co-authored with Niall Harney and David McDonald, and we called it Funding Our Way, trying to put forward a progressive vision for the government of Manitoba to look at how we could restructure our tax system to not only have greater equality through our tax system, but to also generate more revenue for the important types of services that we're here to talk about today, not just health and education, but our broader social safety net for childcare to support action to help those experiencing and preventing gender-based violence, and the other types of services that we know are so crucial to not only holding our communities together, but trying to make progress on reducing inequality. So this paper, it presents some fiscal policy alternatives to increase revenue options and modify our tax system. And primarily what we're trying to do here is make this system work better for working and middle class families with ongoing reliable support to deal with the rising cost of living. We all know inflation has hit people hard, but the people who it hits the hardest are those who don't have enough to begin with. And what I'm going to try to show you today is the type of supports that we've seen at the provincial government level put in place really aren't going to those who need it, and focusing really in on tax cuts and how tax cuts are a really bad way to try to help people with the cost of living, primarily because they distribute the benefits in a very unequal way. So the key findings from our report, and there's 4 of them I'll just start off with here. The first is, if we look at what's happened since 2016 and the election of the Progressive Conservative government, we've seen 1.6 billion in revenues being cut from the provincial treasury. And these revenues being given away through tax cuts are going to those who are primarily, if we look at where this money's going, it's going towards those who are already doing very well off in our society. And what we've also seen is that these tax cuts have a cost. They've been paid for through higher deficits, cuts to the provincial public service, and we've seen federal transfers, for example, that have been going up quite significantly since 2016. These transfers are for things like healthcare, for education and other services. What's actually happening is these federal transfers are just backfilling these tax cuts. So I did some work with Susan Prentice, who many of you probably have heard of, who's a very strong advocate for publicly funded nonprofit childcare in Manitoba. And we showed together that despite the expansion of childcare in Manitoba that we've seen through the federal $10 a day initiative, the provincial government has actually cut funding. Its own revenues are actually giving less to childcare than they were back in 2016. So that's the first point. The second point is that these tax cuts have brought Manitoba's own source revenue. So if we take out the federal transfers, if we look at the revenue that Manitoba's generating, and we compare that to the size of the economy, we're at a record low. Okay, so we're at a point now where it's going back at least decades. We can see that our revenues that we're generating through our provincial system are the lowest they've ever been. And what that does is that makes our province very vulnerable. It makes our province vulnerable to a change in federal policy. If you look at the polls right now, it's not looking like the Trudeau government is doing very well. And the alternative, unfortunately, that seems to be lining up is the federal Conservatives, which are not supportive of a lot of the transfers that the provincial Liberals have been providing to the provinces. The third main point is when you look at Manitoba's tax revenues, We actually don't have high taxes, right? The previous government, the story they were trying to tell us is that Manitoba is a high tax province and we have to cut our taxes to be competitive. Well, what I'm going to show you today is that actually isn't true. We range from the lowest to average among provinces. When we look at the revenue we bring in compared to the size of our economy, we actually are not an outlier when it comes to taxation, and I'm going to suggest that we have the room to increase taxes to pay for more redistribution and more investment in social services. The last point I want to make is that the crisis that we're facing in Manitoba when it comes to the state of our public services, whether it's with respect to healthcare funding, recruiting for the broader public sector. I think a lot of us are familiar with health and education, right? Anyone who has a kid in school knows that things have been getting harder and harder for teachers and the other staff that work in schools. Anyone who knows someone working in healthcare, I'm sure has heard stories about how awful the provincial cuts to healthcare have been, and then the pandemic layered on top of that has just created a situation of absolute crisis. We know that the pandemic has created all sorts of challenges that continue with us today, whether it's learning loss with students, whether it's the increase in visible homelessness that we're seeing, just the general intensity of poverty. These are all crises that we could use the revenue that's been given away as tax cuts to help solve. Okay, so I'm going to try to make the case today that what's happening with these tax cuts is really bad public policy. Okay, so let's get into some of the numbers here. This is a table from our report. And what this table does is it breaks down the revenue changes that we've seen since 2016. And we're looking at that from the different type of tax changes that have happened. So I have 3 columns of numbers here. The first column looks at both tax cuts and tax increases, because there were a few tax increases in the first few years. They got rid of some credits for students, for example, who graduated in Manitoba. So we included those in that first column. The second column here, so if we look at the tax increases and the tax cuts, we've lost about $1.2 billion, a bit more than that. If we look at the cuts only, that number goes up to almost $1.5 billion. That's an incredible amount of money. It's hard to wrap our mind around those kind of dollars, and I'll try to illustrate this as we go forward. And then the last column here adjusts for the fact that when you cut taxes, you're not just losing that same amount of money every year, but you're losing more and more money each year because the economy grows, people's incomes go up. So that the damage that tax cut causes to our revenues actually compounds over time. So what I've done in this last category is adjusted for that fact. And when you do that, you get to just under $1.6 billion. So if we would have not proceeded with these tax cuts over the last 8 years, we would have had that much more money to spend on social services. One thing that I think is also very important to highlight is that nearly $500 million of these tax cuts actually took place quite recently. These were lost revenues that were committed in budget 2023. So this was an election year budget. The Conservatives were going into the election and they promised massive tax cuts, and the NDP campaign during the election committed to keeping those tax cuts. And we'll talk a little bit later about that a bit more. So if we look at where most of these tax cuts are coming from, the majority of the cuts are taking place in the income tax system. Okay, so this is a system that in Canada and in Manitoba is a progressive tax. So as your income goes up, the rate that you pay on every dollar earned It's done in steps, but basically those who earn more end up paying a larger percentage of their income in taxes. At least that's how the system is supposed to work. So when we cut those tax rates, we're actually doing something quite regressive, right? We're giving more to those who are well off. The second biggest category of revenue loss here is the sales tax cut, so the cut in the PST. And the third biggest category is the education property tax cuts. So this is the rebate, the checks that were being mailed out to people. And this again is a very regressive tax because it's tax cut because those who have $1 million homes usually end up paying much more in property tax than those people who have more modest homes. So this is a proportional rebate, and people who have mansions are getting these massive checks, and people who have small modest homes and pay very little in tax are getting basically nothing back. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide here. And this just shows that decline in own source revenue that I was talking about. So if you go back to the late 2000s, Manitoba brought in about 18% of the value of its economy in taxes and other provincial revenues. And we've seen that steadily decline, and we've seen some pretty big drops in the last 4 years when we've seen those tax cuts take place. So this is that downward trend and that record low that I was talking about. Okay, now when we compare Manitoba to other provinces, so we'll go to the next slide, we can look at how we bring in taxes and how we compare in a few different ways. If we look just at taxes and fees, we're 7th out of the 10 provinces when it comes to the amount of revenue we bring in compared to our economy. We're 5th, so right near the middle, among provinces for income tax revenue from households. And we're actually dead last, number 10, when it comes to corporate tax revenue compared to the size of our economy. So that, to me, doesn't look like a province that is out of step with other provinces when it comes to how much we're paying in taxes, despite what the previous finance minister and premier were telling Manitobans. Okay. We're also the only province not to tax the income of small business. Okay. With zero rate, no other province has no income tax on small business. So what I suggest is that this data shows that Manitoba is not out of step with the rest of the country, and we have fiscal space to modestly increase taxes. Okay. Now, when we look at inequality, so if we can go to the, yeah, excellent, thank you. If we look at what's been happening with inequality in Manitoba since 2016, and this is very predictable, we've seen our tax system become relatively less progressive, and what has meant is that we have seen inequality increase in Manitoba. We've seen inequality increase from where it was before, but we've actually seen our position compared to other provinces get worse when it comes to inequality. Basically, what has happened is these tax cuts have made our system less progressive, and we're now seeing higher inequality in Manitoba because of that. And we're losing ground compared to other provinces when it comes to the benefit that we get through redistribution with our tax system. So increasing taxes, again, here is an option to reduce inequality while at the same time generating revenue for redistribution. We want to have more cash benefits for those who are lower income, but it also can help reduce inequality by investing in public services that middle class and low income Manitobans rely on and have fewer alternatives compared to those who are better off. I'll talk a little bit about why these tax cuts, this argument that I made for income tax cuts is similar for other tax cuts as well. So if we look at property taxes, if you do a tax cut on the rate of what you're paying, or you have a rebate check based on how much you pay. If you have a property tax cut based on the value of the property, then those who have higher value properties get more back through that rebate program. Okay? And in the case of property tax cuts, it's incredibly unequal because those who don't own property don't get anything, right? If you're a renter and you cut property taxes, then you end up with nothing. Now, the NDP during the election promised a gas tax cut, right? Everyone drives a car, right? Well, no, we know that everyone doesn't drive a car, but we know that's not true, right? Those who can't afford a car and have to take the bus get no benefit from the gas tax cut, okay? So in many ways, the gas tax cut suffers from the same inequality increasing problems that we see from an income tax cut. Those who have big fancy luxury cars who use lots of gas, those are going to be people who get the biggest benefit from this, and those who take the bus get nothing. Okay? If we look at the carbon tax cut, so this is a big issue at the federal level, right? The Conservative Party of Canada has been, spending their every breath of air they have in front of a microphone axing the tax, right? We need to get rid of the carbon tax. And it's a hard narrative to fight against, right? Because heat is a necessity, right? Often transportation is a necessity. And we usually don't like to tax necessities because low-income people spend more of their income on necessities, right? But the argument here is very similar to the gas tax, right? If you look at who pays the carbon tax, it's going to be the people with the giant homes that they're heating. It's going to be the people who have, using large amounts of gas. And what's even worse about this idea of axing the climate action incentive at the federal level is that all the money that goes into that program, so all the money that's raised through the carbon tax, actually gets paid back out to Manitobans and Canadians, and it's done in a flat benefit way, right? So if you have a tax that taxes people based on how much they're consuming of fossil fuels, and you give everybody back an equal share of that, that actually reduces inequality, right? And there's been studies that very clearly show that the climate action incentive is very beneficial for low-income Canadians because they don't spend as much money into the tax. They get way more back through the credit. And now that credit is paid multiple times a year into people's bank accounts, right? So getting rid of the climate action incentive is just another tax cut for those who are well off, okay? And one thing about the gas tax and the carbon tax that we often don't hear about is that these taxes apply to businesses and corporations too, right? So when we get rid of these taxes, we're actually giving a business tax cut, right? It's a hidden tax for those who are doing quite well off. And we know that corporations have done very well since 2020. I'm going to talk about one more example here, and I'm going to talk about sales tax cuts, okay? So the sales tax cut, again, is one of these situations where people often argue you're paying the sales tax on consumption, and low-income people spend their money on things, and so they benefit from a sales tax cut. And I don't want to minimize that, yes, $1 back in the pocket of someone who is struggling is important, right? But we need to remember that when we cut taxes for everybody, we're benefiting those who have the highest income the most. A sales tax cut is mostly going to send money back to those who are well off, who are on the top half of the income distribution, and those who are at the bottom are only going to get a very small amount. So what I want to do now is go on to the next slide and show the example here of what we're proposing. So we're proposing a progressive change in our tax system that would increase the amount of taxes that are paid by the well-off, and increase the benefits or the rebates that go to those who have lower incomes. So if we click a few more times here, we can see under our system that those who are higher income after our proposed changes will end up getting less back on their taxes or end up paying more taxes, where we'll have the highest benefits going to those at the bottom of the income spectrum. Okay, so those who need it the most. And the way we've structured it is that our proposal is going to help those who have average incomes. So we're making it so that the majority of Manitobans are better off under our system of tax changes compared to the status quo. Okay, so what are we proposing? We can go to the next slide. The first thing we're proposing is to turn that basic personal amount I was talking about, okay, that tax credit that everybody gets, the amount that you can earn before you start paying taxes, into an income-tested refundable credit. Okay? So income tested, what does that mean? What it means is at a certain point in the income spectrum, okay, so once people earn an above average amount of money, then they stop getting the credit. That's really a simplified version of what that means when we say income tested. And the second main point there is to make it refundable. Okay? So this is another big problem with this basic personal amount in the tax system that the previous premier promoted as a tool to help people who are low income. The reality is if you don't have the taxes owing, you don't benefit from this credit at all. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can design a credit and specify that a credit is refundable. And there's many of those in our system right now. So we're saying make that refundable. Don't require that people have the income. Allow low-income people to benefit from that credit. The second main change that we're proposing is to return the PST and the income tax brackets back to where they were in 2016. We're basically calling for a reversal of the tax cuts that have taken place, and we're calling for a new high income tax bracket. And then finally, we're proposing to eliminate most other personal tax credits, including the school tax rebate, and fold that all into this new basic personal amount. Okay? And this basic personal amount then would work very much like a basic income. Oh, excellent. Okay, yeah, so table 4, I don't know the page number, I'm sorry, but what we have here in table 4 is showing by income decile. So by income decile here, what we're showing, so we divide up the population, you line up everybody by income, and then you divide them into 10 equal groups. Okay? So when people talk about the top 10% or the bottom 10%, that's what we're doing here. So if we look at the change in disposable income for the bottom 10% of income earners under our system, they're going to see a massive increase. Over $12,000 a year in increased disposable income. And we see that benefit get lower as we go up the deciles, up until the median decile, where we have the average group in the middle getting about $1,800 more a year. Yeah. And so on average, all Manitobans, if you added up the net benefit for everybody and divided it by the population, people would get an extra $491 a year. But the main point here is that the higher income people are going to be paying much more, and the lower income people are going to be getting much more in transfers. So those who who have disposable incomes above $150,000 a year, so after tax income, they're going to pay $15,000 more in taxes. Those who have less than $23,000 of income will get $12,000 more a year through our proposed changes. Okay. We also propose some business tax measures. So if we can go to the next slide. We're proposing to increase the corporate income tax rate by 1%, up to 13%. We're proposing to reverse the business tax cuts to the health and education levy, so this is a payroll tax. We're proposing getting some additional, we're calling for raising the PST, so we've accounted for the consumer side of that already in our previous calculations, but businesses also pay PST, so that's going to add some revenue as well. We're proposing to eliminate the school tax rebate for corporations, not just households, so that'll generate some more revenue. And we're proposing to eliminate the child care development tax credit, which was a tax credit implemented by the previous government aimed at supporting private for-profit child care provision. We also propose changing the land transfer tax to make it more progressive. So this is the tax you pay when you buy a piece of land. And we also suggest introducing what we're calling a mansions tax, so a surtax on the highest income property or highest value properties. So if we go to Table 5, Table 5 summarizes the total revenue change from our proposed measures. So the income and sales tax measures, so this change to increase taxes on high income earners and institute this basic income type benefit, does end up costing money. In our proposal, we were trying to get everyone up to 2/3 of the poverty line with the benefit, while at the same time making sure that at least the bottom half of Manitobans were better off. Now, this is all adjustable, right? You could, if you were in government and running the show, you wouldn't have to implement this exactly, but the general idea is that it would be redistributive. In our particular example, it ended up costing more afterwards by about $250 million. Our business tax measures that we're proposing bring in $312 million, and then our other measures bring in $67 million. So that generates a net increase of around $123 million to invest back in public services over and above this new basic income benefit. Okay. Why do we need this? I'm sure many of you in this room don't need me to tell you why we need to be generating more revenue for public services, but if you'll bear with me here, I'll make a quick case. We've just gone through 7 years of what I would say is brutal austerity. We've seen cuts in our public sector, we've seen wage freezes, we've seen community organizations having their funding cut, we've seen entire programs eliminated, like the Neighborhoods Alive program. I could go on, and this has led to a particularly awful state in our health, education, and other public services. It's gotten to the point where the wages of public sector workers are so low, they can't even hire anyone. People aren't applying for the jobs anymore. The second main reason I would put to you is recovering from the pandemic, okay? I know a lot of people like to say the pandemic's over, and maybe in some ways it's changed and is certainly different than it was in the first phases of the pandemic, but the legacy of the pandemic is still with us, right? We have people who are burned out. We have children, particularly children from lower income families who were the most harmed by the school closures and needed the support after the fact to catch up. And that requires investment, right? I could go on and on. The homelessness we're seeing on our streets, it was quite remarkable, right? During the pandemic, we solved homelessness, right? In a way, for a very short period of time, because people were afraid of COVID spreading amongst those who were unhoused, there was resources made available, right? We opened up hotels, and we put the money in place to make sure everyone had a place to stay, right? It was actually, I think, for housing advocates, a wonderful and incredibly depressing thing, right? Because you could see that you could solve this problem when the political will was there, right? The idea is that we can't come up with the money for it was shown to be false, right? When there's an urgency, when there's a political will, these problems can actually be solved quite quickly. But it didn't take long for the crisis to return. Okay, so this is something we need resources to address. The third argument we put forward in the paper is the tight labor markets that we're facing and the need to invest in our potential to work. Okay, it's still, things have gotten a little bit worse since we published this paper, but this has been the case for decades, where you talk to businesses in Manitoba, and the number one constraint on their growth, they'll always say this: we can't find enough workers, right? But we have one of the youngest populations in the province, or in the federation. We have a vibrant, young, growing Indigenous population who is ready, willing, and able to work with the right supports. And we've shown in the North End in Winnipeg that when you deliver culturally appropriate training, when we start to decolonize our education system and provide genuine options for people, that people will succeed, right? But that takes money, right? We need public money to support these programs, and they're certainly not getting enough right now. And then finally, another reason why we need public resources is to address climate change, right? We know this is another very depressing crisis that we're grappling with, but it's even more depressing because the solutions actually make sense from a financial perspective. Even if you wanted to be totally selfish and say, little old Manitoba, we can't solve the climate crisis, electric vehicles and electric buses are cheaper in the long run, right? We have hydropower here. We have the ability to help people retrofit their homes and save energy in a way that's very cost effective from a social perspective. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Those are the type of changes that we can't rely on the private sector to do, right? We can't trust Elon Musk to put up charging stations everywhere. We need a government who's going to lead the way on helping make that transition. And to me, sure, let's transition to electric cars, but for me, I would say the priority should be we need electrified transit, electrified public transit, right? That is where the real savings and opportunity is, in my opinion. So these are just a few places. I know this is what we talk about in the report, but Marianne and your organizations have been working on other areas as well. We know the crisis in child and family services, the highly racialized nature of that system, the continuing legacy of harm to families. We need to make sure that we're investing in alternatives to that system. We need to address the family violence prevention, the lack of supports that are there. When we talk about housing, the shelter system for people trying to leave situations of domestic violence, these are all areas that require investment. And then, of course, housing, right? Housing is another issue that we're hearing about every day, and it's social housing is incredibly important, and we need to push for more social housing units. But housing is becoming out of reach for more and more of the population, right? So this is an issue that we can't be relying on the private sector and the private market to allocate this basic need. We need more government investment in providing nonprofit and public alternatives. But to start to wrap up, what we're proposing is that instead of tax cuts that largely benefit the wealthy, we should be providing policy alternatives that target benefits to working and middle class families and help them the most, while increasing revenues to help rebuild public services. Our overall package of policy reforms also supports moving people into paid work in the labor force and supports other investments around climate change mitigation, to promote inclusive economic growth. And I'd also like to highlight, and I'll talk a little bit more about this now, that the new government's election commitments place serious constraints on Manitoba's ability to repair the damage of 7 years of austerity. Okay. Obviously, the new government is more committed to a more progressive vision for Manitoba, but without the money, we're already seeing how limited that can be. So this wraps up what we talked about in the report. I've done some more recent analysis, and I'll just give a little bit of a recap on that. Some of you may have heard that once the NDP government came into power and they looked at the books at the province, suddenly we've seen things are much worse than were advertised. Okay, so the Manitoba government released a second quarter report back in December, and when we compare that report to the budget, which the Conservatives took to the public in the election, we saw the budget deficit grow by $1.25 billion. Okay, now that is quite shocking. Okay, and to put that in perspective, during the COVID crisis in the first year in 2020, the budget deficit increased by $1.9 billion. Okay, so this change is a massive change in the fiscal forecast for the province. Now there's three main contributors to this. The first was a drop in projected hydro revenues. Manitoba Hydro is a big revenue source for the province, and you may have noticed the rivers in Winnipeg were pretty low last year, right? And that's a problem throughout the system, right? So no water, less hydro. So not the end of the world, but one of the explanations here. The second reason was renegotiated agreements in healthcare. Okay, so the wages had been frozen, what doctors were getting paid had been frozen, and in a last election year hustle to try and save their bacon, the Conservatives started signing these agreements with workers in the system. So there was a big increase in cost there. And then finally, what we saw here was a decrease in forecast tax revenues, and what they were saying was because of a change in economic projections. Okay. Now, this is, I have some questions about this, and I won't get into the details here. I have some questions about whether this huge drop in revenues can be explained by this forecast, but I'll highlight some interesting facts here. So one, coincidentally, the new budget deficit being projected is $1.6 billion. You may have heard earlier in my presentation that is almost exactly the amount that the Conservatives have cut in taxes during their reign, and that the NDP promised to keep those tax cuts. Okay. It is also remarkable how the increase in the deficit due to this economic change was just coincidentally exactly equal to the income tax cut that took place in budget 2023. So I have my suspicions, but regardless of the details of this situation, what we can see is that we wouldn't be in this problem today if we restore those taxes, right? These tax cuts are the true cause of Manitoba's fiscal crisis right now. It's not a spending crisis. It's a fact that we've been cutting taxes for high-income earners and the wealthy, and we frankly can't afford it if we want to have a functioning social safety net. Now, unfortunately, we are in a position today where the NDP government cannot meet all of their election commitments because of this new fiscal forecast. And what has happened is the Premier has committed to keeping these tax cuts. But it seems like every other commitment is up for negotiation, right? So we're launching a campaign, we've launched a campaign to try to convince him and the NDP government otherwise. That you may have committed to these tax cuts, but you also committed to reversing 7 years of austerity. You've committed to reinvesting in our health and social safety net, and you've made other commitments as well. And we think those are actually more important than your commitment to keep these tax cuts for the rich. Okay. So I believe this is built in to our day's programming today to try and get you to sign on to our public letter, our open letter to the provincial government to say we're in a new situation than during the election, and it's only reasonable to reevaluate all of your commitments, not just your ones to our public services. Thank you very much.